requirements and the openings have to go.
And the more, folks on this topic again, or do something out there in Washington, I'd be happy to come out sometime. It'd be great.
Sure. Let me give you this.
So, but you're not
Right.
No, there's no official program at SIP. I still do independently, and we're not prepared to make it public yet, but actually I will finish up with SIP after
On this one, focus more broadly at
larger United Nations University project on project on assessment everything that is brought to do in USIP we've done, and been delighted. It's been a great time. But I feel strongly to go back to that public for another conference.
Yeah, you're right.
So
No,
that's
they're the
why
ones
you should
generally targeted. Well, the ones that are targeted.
reach out to me.
Right. Yeah.
Great.
I heard you go, I saw you there.
But they've been right. And actually, because of the U.S. government, they don't know either. Some point, so laws have been written, but how do you okay, this is now but how do you practically do that? What other laws might be targeted for it?
Yeah.
The internet companies are smart.
But it's coming along. We have a
It's also a problem because they're internet companies. So everybody, two examples. There's only so much that they're doing that is
By definition, it's like,
Okay.
So we have public we
Oh, that's right.
We
That's
have the
right.
background people.
Yeah.
We have a 2-hour public hearing. Discussion.
So let me give you my card.
So it's going to be the background people, it's a 2-hour public hearing, and that's fine. Okay, great. This oh my God. I know. India, Cuba, Venezuela.
I mean, I thought it was not
Maybe, also when you
Yes.
and I did the reading ahead of time. Wow, that was good.
I know, that was good.
Thank you.
So should we follow you? No,
Yeah,
we
we've
just,
been-
I wanted to say hello.
Good,
But I can't stick
no,
in. I can't stay for the whole thing. But I
No, I was just invited to Florida.
Oh, go.
no, please, yeah. Thank you.
That's the same guy. That's Venezuela. Back.
Hey, no problem. I'm going to go out and get some now.
The last speaker explained it. Basically, the Venezuelan economy was crumbling. The euro had no legitimacy whatsoever. Suddenly, you get these sanctions, and it was a gift wrap for Maduro to claim, this isn't my fault. Now I've got the big imperialist Yankee bully, claiming we're a threat to national security. It's not that they're going to. It was a short-term failure. I think in the end they're inconsequential. Yep. Hi. Oh, hi.
Advisor to the chief economist.
Oh.
First of all, I really enjoyed the talks. Second, it's in early stages, but I'm actually leading a research initiative just to
There we go. Okay.
Interesting.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry. I apologize. I will. You're on next, right? Yes. But let's sit together for lunch. Yes. Okay. Thanks. I should probably get down.
How are you? Very good. Margaret, are you on the book? I know you have new ones. Thank you so much. And I regular at the U.S. James. I'm a freelance. No. The other day, Georgetown Treasury official was saying that our sanction against Russia was I said, if that's the case, why such a swine and we let 11 million people in Cuba with Hitler? He said, that's a different case. Now I understand. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
very much debate on it. It's called the Gift Debate. And its little tag is against media war. The idea is it's our pushback against the imperialists or the
First Iran, going back to Reagan pipeline. I mean, it's an interesting exercise how to coerce lines. I mean, do you think it's sort of it's almost predictable lines in the context of
I recognize that it's very public, it's very valid as a reaction, but like in the Cuba case, I know that a lot of people are very proud of Cuba and they're used to U.S. citizens, but at the same time, they're under no illusions that they have a friend in Raul Castro. They see that they have two enemies, the U.S. policy and their government, right? And Russia, does the one kind of cancel out the other, or do they kind of have like, I mean, obviously there's different people who are very...
Randy, I'll be back in 1 minute here. I thought it was a very nice start to this conference.
Yeah, that was very good.
Very helpful. So,
I'm going to actually start, instead of with my slides, with the response.
good, good. It's free flowing. It's free flowing. I love that. Yes.
Randy's second or third?
Randy's gonna be second. We're gonna start with Elizabeth, Randy, and then Richard.
Then we'll do a little bit of pause while I have to bring the screen down for his presentation.
Can you bring the screen down just to start? Or is that because doesn't look bad? Well, we don't want to look bad. So yeah, it just makes sense because Randy leads into Richard much more than. Okay.
And just to make sure we got it going here, right?
I'm sorry.
If you just take a look, make sure I got the right presentation on here. It'll be just down here.
Okay, and I'll have a clicker.
Yep. Oh, yeah, we don't have the screen down yet, so just take a look here. This is the one. So I'll come set it up when the time comes. Yeah, just do it right. And if you need it, that's how.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Fine, how are you?
Well, thank you.
I'm Bregman.
Hi. Oh, it's freezing up here.
You were what?
It's freezing up here. It's all right.
Well, I work in Russia, so I like
This is all right.
This feels normal. Makes me-
You do, huh?
Well, and I like cold weather. Maybe that's how I got interested in Russia. Seems like it's counting your
They were
words
pretty
as well
resigned
as your seconds.
Yeah.
And I think pleasantly surprised that we had really looked at quite narrow areas and long-term interests rather than current production. And
Just to make an obvious point, if you do move to the center of the aisle, it's less likely someone will step on your feet. They are almost certainly going to be coming throughout the second panel, so up to you.
First world countries is always in difficult places. It's part of the risk model.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, sure. I mean, anyone who does business in Russia knows that it's politically a high-risk environment, and you've got to factor it in. So I got a much less bumpy ride from them than I expected.
So it's filling up.
Yeah, it is. It was pretty full for the first week. It was getting better. You were looking forward, but it was getting better.
It was a fascinating panel. I feel like my talk's going to be dull compared to that, since I was just talking about the laws.
And I think,
Well, I think
they also
somehow
know
we
that
have-
it's unsustainable
we have to get
for
into
governments
it.
as well as for industry
that's
to do
Russia's
this, to
sanctions
see these as
program
very
without
long-term sanctions. So they're looking at writing it out, understanding.
I'm going to
where
start
it's
actually
going,
with that.
and getting back into the kind of longer-term development whenever they can. And we're encouraging them to do that.
And then I think again, pontificate throwing their terms working.
They were saying, why is commodity prices?
That's a little
Okay, and,
And I think the short answer
I'm going to sort of start off with the question of what's the definition of working? It's possible to say that the sanctions have stopped the Russians from going further.
So
Exactly.
and furthermore,
the unknown
plan to be that big, you must be in every
Yeah.
Because would they have hit you?
and you're not a national oil company.
Who the heck knows? But they could have.
So you have to just figure out how to train.
Yeah.
Have that however slow.
Everyone can take their seats, please. We'll get started in about 1 minute, so we'll give everyone a little bit more time to come in. We'll leave the door open, but that hush implies I think everyone's ready to move on anyway. Well, as Professor Henkin mentioned, we're now moving on to smart sanctions. And I think this panel will be a little bit different because we're going to go a little bit more into the weeds, both in the U.S. sanctions programs, but also we're very fortunate to have a representative here who can also talk about the EU sanctions. Because I think one of the important issues, especially dealing with the Russian sanctions, but also with the Iranian sanctions, was the multilateral efforts and the involvement of the EU in those sanctions. So we're going to begin, though, with Elizabeth Rosenberg. She is a senior fellow and director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She's previously worked at the Treasury Department. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to be here today. I'm going to talk about three things in my opening remarks. The first is the birth of smart sanctions. I was asked to discuss. Here, lay that out for you. I'll tell you why I think that term is not one we should stick with anymore, but if that wasn't made abundantly clear in the last panel. Second, their application to Iran. Excuse me. And third, what happens next on Iran sanctions? So first, on the evolution of smart sanctions, this is the phrase that we saw in the 90s, referring to this evolution in sanctions, movement away from the trade embargo model to ones that are narrower, trying to look at regime elites and not create an economic effect or as significant an economic effect on the broader population. But there's been a number of evolutions since then, and we're ready for some new terminology to describe how much smarter, if you will, they've become or more economically effective in the last 20 years. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But to draw a bit of an arc here and necessarily, I suppose, to summarize a few things from the last panel, sanctions are, of course, an old tool broadly, and certainly in the United States. Their use here is as old as this country. As was discussed, they are used sometimes with effect, sometimes with lesser effect, which is why one of the primary reasons why in the 1990s there was this move towards smart sanctions, acknowledging some of the serious problems from the previous era. And when I talk about sanctions or describe the arc of their development, I like to do it in 4 stages. Excuse me. And the first one I'll talk about is this comprehensive embargo, which I will keep very brief because we heard a lot about it in the last panel. But this is, of course, the economic or investment model, not so much financial and not specific to transactions, banking transactions, or correspondent banking relationships, which we see later on. This is the Cuba, perhaps the Iraq model. The second one is the beginning of targeted sanctions. And so here we're talking about mid-90s till about the mid-2000s or so, focusing on regime leaders and trying not to wrap up the population in economic effects. This is a time of going after more specific targeted conduct of concern, terrorism, for example, regional destabilization, narco-trafficking. New authorities were announced in this era that have become very significant and heavily relied upon now. So the U.S. administration, the president put forward Executive Order 13224, the primary terrorism authority under which many entities, terrorists, and supporters of terrorists have been designated right after 9/11, also in September of 2001. And in this period, we've seen sanctions characterized by some designations, but restrictions on weapon sales, investment prohibitions, asset freezes. And the third stage that I want to mention here is smarter sanctions, more targeted, new authorities, new designations, but specifically this period from the mid-2000s till 2010, I want to characterize as being one where there was an intense focus on reputational harm. There were new authorities in this era. Specifically, I want to highlight Executive Order 13382, the Proliferation Authority, under which many Iranian targets have been named, hundreds, and others. That was in July of 2005. Also, the Patriot Act 311, Section 311 authority was used against Banco Delta Asia, as was previously mentioned, in 2005. And the beginning of a number of UN Security Council resolutions in 2006 on Iran. So what this was doing was putting many, many more entities under sanctions. We saw a lot of Iranian banks at this time, and this aggressive campaign by the U.S. Treasury Department officials who logged a lot of mileage credits by traveling around the world to visit foreign financial regulators and foreign financial institutions, telling them to stay away from illicit finance and creating this that is the reason for which a number of entities were designated. So creating a sense of toxicity or tarnishing the Iranian financial sector in particular, and of course others. There were further other mechanical changes, if you will, to the U.S. financial system functioning, which served to greatly or significantly more seriously restrict the ability of designated entities, those blacklisted or sanctioned companies, from accessing the U.S. financial system. So the fourth stage that I'll highlight is one of, from 2010 to the present, an era of more targeted financial sanctions and what I have called micro-targeted financial sanctions because of the way they've been imposed and the particular nature of the target they go after, not in people or entities necessarily, but even smaller, towards unique financial instruments. They have had a greater effect in starving targets from access to hard currency. They've gone after correspondent banking relations, so the mechanics of banking sector transactions, which has shown to be quite effective economically. This is the era of secondary sanctions really taking hold, and this is where U.S. sanctions force foreign financial institutions to make a choice between doing business with a designated entity, say the Iranian set of Iranian banks or the central bank, or the U.S. Financial system, which is a choice that is pretty clear for most global financial institutions and large regional ones. There's just no comparison which actor, which economy you'd rather do business with, that being, of course, preference for the United States. Sectoral sanctions we've seen in this period, which block off entire areas of economic activity for the target of sanctions, and greater correlation and interconnection between sanctions and trade controls. trade controls, the authorities for the U.S. Commerce Department significantly controlled by the BIS. In this era, also, I mentioned briefly previously, but there's a growing fear of violation, and this fear of reputational harm really starts to take hold. So the work of these U.S. Treasury Department officials talking about the risks for violating sanctions, for reputational harm, the AML-CFT risks, for getting involved, even accidentally, with designated entities, starts to have a very powerful impact in the way the private sector entities think about their compliance strategy and managing risk. So shifting now to the second item I wanted to talk about, the application of sanctions to Iran. In this arc of sanctions, there are a few important things I want to point out at the outset. They're quite long-standing. In the United States, they've existed in some versions since 1979. They are extensive, they are comprehensive. No other country has been targeted by so many sanctions beside Iran, by U.S. sanctions. There are many sanctions authorities. Congress has passed a variety of pieces of sanctions legislation. There are 3 main statutes which have been modified by yet other pieces of legislation. The White House, of course, has put out a variety of executive orders, some specific to Iran, some not specific to Iran, but specific to certain kinds of conduct, which, of course, has great relevance to and specificity to Iran indirectly. There are perhaps close to 1,000 Iranian-linked entities on the U.S. sanctions list. That's a tremendous number. They are multilateral sanctions against Iran. Of course, the United States has many, but there are a variety of other countries or jurisdictions. We'll probably talk about the EU here, as well as independent jurisdictions within the EU that also have their own sanctions on Iran, the UN, of course, and other countries. I'll just mention Canada, Australia, Japan, Switzerland, etc. They are predicated on, these sanctions, or imposed pursuant to, a variety of different provocative, illicit, and concerning behaviors. We've heard today already a mention of terrorism, proliferation, human rights violations, regional destabilization. And I like to remind people that they are, while comprehensive and strategic, not very systematic in their application, which is structurally something you're going to have you're going to be stuck with, because there are so many different authorities that have been put in place by different policy-making bodies in different jurisdictions, and they don't necessarily speak to each other. They have autonomy and independence. So as has been mentioned, I hope we have the chance to talk more about this, they're driving at different objectives and different targets, which creates some challenges for this strategy. So let me quickly run through a couple of the mechanics of these sanctions. The U.S. embargo that has been in place in some version or another, modified over time, bars U.S. people and companies from doing business in Iran. It got a lot stronger in the mid-1990s when the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was passed. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. And it has been, of course, adapted a variety of times since then, as have the implementing regs that instruct companies how they should follow this, basically. In 2006, the UN Security Council imposed its first set of Iran-related sanctions, first of 4, in 4 different resolutions. And then there was this serious effort in the mid to late 2000s to designate quite a lot of Iranian banks to vilify and create a sense of toxicity around its financial sector. Using U.S. authorities, the United States, as well as the justification of the UN Security Council, the United States went around to other countries, persuading them to join, cajoling them, coercing them. They eventually, an international coalition has subsequently emerged. There was a lot of pushback initially, particularly in Europe and elsewhere, but that has changed, and now European financial institutions are some of the most aggressive in de-risking, what's called de-risking or dumping Iran business, even where it may be permitted in order to avoid potential violation or reputational harm. I'm going to fast forward to 2 inflection points that I want to call out where I think sanctions on Iran became much more forceful economically. We can debate whether that makes them more effective. The first one was in 2010 with the imposition of secondary sanctions in the United States, or SASADA, focused on Iran's international banking relationships. And this caused that us or them choice for foreign financial institutions. Are you going to go with Iran? Are you going to go with the U.S. financial system? It was coercive. It was extremely effective, even without naming many targets under the sanctions authority. In fact, only 2 have been named, and 1 has come off again since then. This, in addition to those Security Council resolutions, brought this international compliance together. The SASADA plus the UNSCRs created what has been a very broadly multinational and effective set of sanctions. And in 2012, the other inflection point I want to mention was a big year for Iran sanctions, not just in the United States, but internationally, going after Iran's energy sales and also narrowing its access to the international financial system. This is when we saw the creation of new authorities in the United States forcing foreign buyers of Iranian oil to get out of the Iranian oil business or else significantly reduce, that's the official term, their purchases of Iranian oil or face getting cut off from the United States. The EU also banned Iranian oil imports. They sanctioned, everyone sanctioned the Central Bank of Iran and kicked, the EU kicked Iran out of the SWIFT payment messaging system, all of which had the substantial effect of squeezing Iran hard and causing a massive GDP contraction, a currency plunge. This wasn't helped at all by some poor domestic economic mismanagement by President Ahmadinejad. I just want to note one thing here with regard to the economic pain. It was relatively contained in Iran at a period of pretty tight international oil markets because the United States was pumping out about 1 million new barrels of oil per year over the last several years, and because Saudi Arabia also was able to expand its production, this helped to keep a cap on international oil prices. So notwithstanding the relatively rapid removal of 1 million barrels of oil from the international oil market from Iran, the rest of global consumers did not see a massive spike with the attendant economic effects for everybody else. Rouhani was, of course, elected on a platform of economic reform in 2013, and later that year, Iran entered into negotiations with the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council in Germany, over its nuclear program to, in turn, relieve sanctions. The future for Iran sanctions, my last point, and I'll close with this. The P5+1 and Iran have been negotiating for some 15 months with 2 extensions. They reached framework understandings, not an agreement, for those focusing on the particular terminology here, earlier this month. Their final deadline to reach an agreement is June 30th, and a lot rides on hitting that deadline. There are potential spoilers, perhaps inside the P5+1 negotiations, and certainly outside. People don't have to look very far in Washington, specifically at the U.S. Congress, to look at one of the most significant potential spoilers. With regard to sanctions, they've talked about increasing sanctions on Iran to, depending on which legislator you're talking about, some see that as an opportunity to force Iran to make greater concessions in the talks, some to try and make Iran capitulate in the talks, and some to make Iran so unhappy that it will walk away from the talks. Congress, of course, has not imposed new sanctions during these negotiations, though there's a bill all ready to go in the Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Tuesday marked up a bill that would give them oversight, or it's an oversight bill, give them a period of congressional review for an agreement if passed, during which time they will tie the president's hands on his ability to offer relief tied to sanctions put in place by Congress. That is not all of the sanctions in the United States, but it's significant sanctions which compel a lot of that pressure on the Iranian economy with regard to its banking sector and the energy sector. So now we wait and see if the negotiators will be able to come to a resolution and make an agreement by June 30th. And if in the Q&A section people want to talk about what it might look like to relieve those sanctions, how the private sector might react, I'd be happy to talk about that then.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. It is, of course, one of the great ironies that Russia was always seen as being a great, important part of resolving the Iranian crisis, the Iranian sanctions, is still actually engaged in the lifting of these Iranian sanctions, and yet at the same time now is also such a focus of sanctions itself. I don't think anyone would have anticipated that scenario 2-3 years ago. But we're very pleased to have Randy Bregman here, who is a partner in Denton's public policy and regulation practice and a longtime practitioner of Russian law and Russian trade here in the United States. And he's going to address both the sanctions and the broader policy issues as well. Randy.
Thank you, Will, and I'd like to thank the Kennan Institute and the Henry Jackson Foundation for organizing this meeting. You may think it's luck that the timing is right, but it seems from our previous presentations, the timing is always right for this issue. So I think you nailed it, but would have nailed it anyway. A dear friend and colleague and law partner of mine used to say that most people in the world look at the world either at the forest or at the trees, except for lawyers who look at the twigs. And much of my presentation will be the twigs. That is, what are the current Ukraine-related sanctions dealing against Russia? But I'd like to, in a way, start off with the challenge that Professor Lopez introduced about asking the Russian people if we think that the sanctions are working. I think the first step in that answer is, I'm going to sound again like a lawyer, but it depends on what you mean by working. And in this case, I think there are ways that you can argue that it's working, but without being able to prove it. But you can't prove at the same time that it's not working. One way is to look at what's happened in Ukraine as the sanctions have been ratcheted up. And the Russians have stopped at a certain point. They annexed Crimea, that started the sanctions. They supported the rebels in the eastern part of Ukraine that increased the sanctions, but now there is a ceasefire. Now, obviously, as in the case of most ceasefires, there are violations of it, but it does seem like certain lines have been drawn, and I suspect around those lines that there are negotiations going on to lead to a solution that both the Ukrainians and the Russians, much less the Europeans and the Americans, may not be happy with, but that's what happens in war, the ends of war, that you're not completely happy with. I think there's another way that you can say that the sanctions may be working. And maybe will have something to say on this at the end, either to agree with me or disagree with me. But Russia is not, we'll get into the differences between the Russian sanctions and the other ones in the bulk of my presentation. But Russia is also a different country than the others. It's a much bigger country, much more strategically, historically strategically important, and a much more important part of what you might call the Western economy. It was a member of G8. That's a rather important position, even if it was brought in part to encourage the development in Russia. It's a big economy. It's an important economy. And sanctioning it has implications, some of which the previous presenters made, but I think it also has implications inside Russia, and that there has been a group of economic reformers in Russia, not dissidents like we talked about in Cuba, but reformers that came to life even in the Soviet Union in the Gorbachev era, and continue to be an important part of the government, continue to be very important economic advisors to Putin and in the Kremlin, and continue to have a significant political impact within the country. And these people have suggested, as much as you can publicly, that They think the war, the Russian participation in the war in Ukraine is a bad thing for the Russian economy. They haven't quite said it like that. I wouldn't say even paraphrasing, and I'm translating it. But they see it not from the policy point of view, not whether it's right or wrong for Russia to have strong influence in Ukraine, but from an economic point of view. And one part of their calculation is the sanctions. And the reason it's important to them is that their view of the way Russia needs to reform economically is to be a full participant in the global economy. And this is obviously, the sanctions are a major, major block to that, as you probably know, and as the twigs I will describe will indicate. So in some ways, I think the sanctions play a role in the thinking of these reformers and in what they say to the president of Russia. And he himself has some interest, personal political interest in the economic development of Russia, and even to some extent the integration into the world economy. So in a way that's hard to measure, and I guess historians, I was going to say 10 years, maybe 50 years from now, will look back and be able to say whether what my point of view is correct or not. But I think it is certainly a factor to consider when you're looking at the effectiveness of the sanctions and whether they should be continued or not. But as a lawyer and not as a policymaker or an academic, that's my foray into politics for today, except if you have questions. I'm going to do a little bit of comparison and contrast of the strategic purpose and scope of the sanctions with those in Iran and Cuba and other places we've talked about. I'm going to look at the sanctions overall from a legal point of view. How do they fit into the U.S. legal structure? I'm going to look at the framework of the sanctions and the issues, the evolution of the sanctions, and then get into the smallest part of the twigs, the specific prohibitions. As a general point, one of the speakers earlier said that there's some, and one of the questioners said that there's often vagueness about what the purpose of the sanctions are. In this case, I think it's quite clear. The sanctions were originally imposed demanding that Russia annul its annexation of Crimea, and then as the political and military developments continued, it was increased to include opposition to Russian military presence in Eastern Europe. And to me, it's very clear, if the Russians stopped all activity in Eastern Europe, and if they gave Crimea back to Ukraine, the sanctions would end. Whether that will happen is a different question, and is probably quite unlikely. And then we get back to the issue raised earlier about what's the bargaining position on these sanctions. There are those in Washington and elsewhere that said Crimea is already a dead question, that it's no longer part of the equation, but it is still part of the legal regime of the sanctions. These sanctions are what I guess what we're calling smart sanctions. They're limited and specific. They can be easily increased. The president can issue an executive order in as long as it takes somebody to type it out. At the same time, he can remove sanctions or decrease them with the same speed. They do not need, unlike other sanctions, they do not need involvement of Congress, at least not yet. Again, this is part of the whole evolution process. Congress has staked a certain claim with a couple of pieces of legislation, but none of those requires the president to do anything, and certainly does not require approval from Congress for increasing or decreasing the sanctions, at least not yet. The sanctions are also, maybe this is what fits into part of this smart sanctions concept, is they were originally meant to be short-term for a specific purpose. They were not designed to be a trade embargo on Russia. That's been modified a bit by the most recent sanctions dealing with Crimea, which is a trade embargo, but for the most part, these are limited sanctions meant to be short-term. As I say in the slide, they're kind of a warning to Russia to stop doing what it's doing, but not designed to isolate the economy from the Russian economy from the world economy, at least in principle. There is a risk in this, however, that as time goes on, as the situation becomes, in some people's words, frozen, that these sanctions will temporarily becomes permanent. But we'll just have to see about that. So far, they're meant to be short-term, and if the two conditions I mentioned are fulfilled, they will be removed. The scope of the sanctions is also very limited, at least in words. And what I mean by that, I'll describe in some more detail later. But the first category of sanctions are, as in other sanctions, the SDN, specially designated nationals. It's a listing of individuals and entities whose assets in the U.S. are frozen and who, in this case, cannot get visas to the United States. It's a limited list so far. It's mostly Russian politicians, some Ukrainian politicians, with direct connections to the military decisions being made in Ukraine with respect to Russian policy, and to a certain group of business people, either those directly connected with the economy in Ukraine during the Yanukovych regime, or what we affectionately call Friends of Putin, which is a nice term for people that have that we think have economic and business ties with Putin, but not Putin himself. It's designed to hurt his friends who have succeeded financially because of Russia's previous policies and involvement with the world economy. The second group of sanctions with Russia are called SSI, Sectoral Sanctions Identification List. And this is not only a limited list of entities, but also very limited sanctions. It has to do, at least again in paper, with debt to certain entities. It was originally U.S. entities couldn't provide debt of more than 90 days. Now it's down to 30 days to those entities on the list. And the list also includes certain oil companies and relationships with them. But it's limited. And it's limited to those companies, and for the most part, in the financial side, it's been state-owned banks or state-controlled banks. But it's a limited list with unlimited potential, and I think this is where the sanctions bite more than they look like on paper. That the effect of this has been to stifle dealings with most Russian financial institutions, either because of concern that they have too much connection to those on the list, or because the list may be extended to include them in the future. It's a very nicely targeted list because it creates more fear effect than actual effect on paper. And I can say a lot of our clients they'll ask the specific questions, do we violate the sanctions? And then they ask, do I think that it's going to violate the sanctions going forward? And that clearly affects their business decisions, even though I can say they're not on the list yet. Enforcement. One of the ways sanctions, as I think have been mentioned before, there's ways to get exemptions from the sanctions is to get specific licenses. I think this is going to be unlikely in the case of Russian sanctions for a couple reasons. One, they are limited, so the humanitarian effects, which is one of the bases for specific licenses, won't be as apparent. And second, I think what I originally started with, that these are meant to be short-term. Licenses take a long time to get, and I think that the approach of OFAC will be, we'll process your license, and then they'll process it slowly with the idea that the sanctions regime will change. Now let me go a little bit to the general overview of the general legal overview of sanctions. U.S. sanctions are set out in a variety of ways. One is laws, 2 is executive orders, 3 is regulations, and 4 is policy pronouncement. So far, in the case of the Ukraine-related sanctions, the specific ones have been through executive orders and some regulation. Obviously, one of these have been these executive orders. The main ones have been executive orders, and they've been issued in a series of sort of increasing scope and foreshadowing the next round of sanctions if they were going to proceed with them. The effect, as I mentioned, though, is broader than what's on the list. And anybody now dealing with Russian banks does much, much more due diligence about who owns the banks, even private banks that are not on the list. Who owns them, who's behind them, are there people that are on either the SDN list or the SSI list? So there's a much more extensive due diligence, which in most cases, I must say, leads to not dealing with the financial institutions at all. This is more of a slide for law students, but since it does not appear to be the audience, I'll go on to the sanctions against Russia, as I said, are not as broad as against Iran or Cuba. We have not imposed a trade embargo, and this is very important because I think there is a common view that Russia is like Iran and Cuba in this regard. The one exception of this, of course, is the most recent executive order, which does impose a trade embargo on doing business with Crimea. The executive orders do authorize these broad sectoral sanctions, which is not entirely new with Russia, but I think it's a concept that has been developed in the most detail in Russia. And as I said before, the purpose is to sort of focus on particular institutions, but only particular functions with those institutions. One of the themes of the program is the evolution of sanctions, and I think Russia is a sort of short course in evolution. We started with warnings, we increased them step by step as the Russian activities and involvement in the region increased, in the Ukrainian region increased. It's important, I noted already that Russia, in this case, is different from Iran and Cuba because it's a much more important part of the world economy. It has significant trade and business with the EU, which is a very important factor in this, as we'll hear more of later. But from the U.S. side, it's been critically important for the Obama administration to try to synchronize as much as possible the sanctions with the EU. And it's a political factor in how far we've gone, and may be a factor if the EU decides to pull back on the sanctions, if that may put pressure on our administration to pull back. And why this is more important in this case than the others is because of the extent of the commercial and economic involvement between EU and in particular Germany, but other EU member states. Now I'm going to get into the smallest of the twigs, which is the specific executive orders and regulations governing the slides, governing the sanctions overall. The first executive order was issued on March 6, 2014, Executive Order 13660. It more or less was announcing that we're going to do economic sanctions against Russia in connection with Ukraine. And it said that if Russia continues, we're going to put specific Russian entities on the SDN list, entities and individuals. Shortly after that, we narrowed that to criteria that would apply to Russia in Executive Order 13661, and then 13662 started designating individuals and entities who would be on the list. In Executive Order 13662, we also introduced the concept of the SSI list, the sectoral sanctions, and indicated that it would be certain sectors that it could include energy, mining, and defense, and finance. But each one of these was sort of alerting the Russians to the next stage, what could happen if they continued, I presume with the hope that it would be the threat that people talked about in the first panel rather than the actual sanctions itself. The threat didn't work. Whether anybody thought it would or not, seriously, we'll know. We won't know, but anyway, I need to conclude. Another area that wasn't included in the executive orders is export controls, and this was export controls mostly in the oil sector, and these were dealt with by the Department of Commerce, and these are important because they focus on the most important economic sector in Russia, oil, and a focus on the new developments in oil, the new equipment for the future of Russian oil production, and the efforts on programs that the Russians were introducing to kind of catch up to the rest of the world in oil production. And then the final one is the Crimean embargo, which makes it sanctionable for any person to invest in Crimea, import to Crimea, and export from Crimea. So with those details, I can be happy to answer questions later.
Thank you very much, Randy. It is very interesting. You talked at the beginning about the economic ramifications and to what extent Putin really thought about them. And I think it became quite clear initially following Putin's reactions that there were probably no economists in the room when Putin took the actions that he did. And it wasn't until well into the crisis that he began consulting his economists. And they all kind of chimed in and basically said that this is really catastrophic for the economy, and that even if we're able to survive the sanctions, what we look forward to is either recession or stagnation. So I think that Putin really didn't take into account at least the economic ramifications, at least initially when he began his Crimean actions. But we're going to move to our third panelist and get the European perspective on Russian sanctions. Richard Wood is currently counselor in the British Embassy's Foreign and Security Policy Group. But before arriving in Washington, he was head of the Russia Sanctions and Economic Security at the Foreign Office in London. So, Richard, the European part of this equation is a very important one, both for Iran and for Russia, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much. Diplomats are much more comfortable down there where you are normally than up here speaking publicly, but I couldn't quite resist when pitched this gig because it was a real fair cop given where I'd come from as head of our whole sanctions program, then to head up a special unit to look at how we could construct a sanctions regime against Russia, and then coming here, and now I'm responsible for the Iran nuclear negotiations and Iran sanctions, so it kind of fitted perfectly. I have to say that we always considered Iran the poster boy of smarter sanctions. It had been constructed very carefully, built up layer upon layer, had responded to attempts by Iran to get around sanctions. It had responded to overcompliance and shortage of humanitarian goods by amending the regulations. It had really been an evolving creature over time, which had looked specifically at how to shut down certain activity in Iran. So that was always our poster boy. We always trotted it out. We always said to ministers, you should use Iran as a good example of how smarter sanctions can work. It's taken a long time, but they've gotten Iran to the table, and that's a good thing, isn't it? Then came Russia, and I thought, do we now use Iran or Russia as our poster boy of smarter sanctions? Because Russia sanctions respond to a completely different situation, I hope I can show, and that other panelists have shown in quite a clever way. And I finally settled on, in a very kind of diplomatic way, pragmatic way of saying they're both the poster boy of smarter sanctions. They're like the 100 meters versus the marathon of in the athletics world. Iran, over 10 years, built up layer after layer, very carefully done, and the quick sprint to the line that was necessary on Russia, if you think back to where we were on March 6th, last year, we needed to do something and do it quickly to respond to overt aggression of Russia on European soil. I think that we did that fairly quickly and built that then in the next couple of months into something more carefully considered. We have an election in the UK in about 3 weeks, so civil servants are not allowed to say anything controversial during that point. I don't think that I am going to say anything controversial because I think successive British governments, it's no secret, have been quite a fan of using sanctions as a tool of foreign policy. I'll come on to just one tool in the toolbox of foreign policy because that's very important. But certainly alongside diplomacy, sanctions represent one of the few significant tools in the box that demonstrate activity on the one hand and the international community's resolve and avoid military action. So we've definitely been quite a fan of them. When I took over as head of sanctions team in London, we had 31 sanctions regimes. It's quite a lot. I think we heard the US has 50 odd, so we're not just the evil colonial power that blindly follows the US. I hope you'll agree, sir. At least in 20 occasions, we just haven't, particularly on Cuba. I made it a personal objective during my time as head of sanctions to try and reduce that number from 31, not because I felt that we didn't value sanctions or they weren't effective in their own way or that they weren't a useful tool, but because we're much less good at ending sanctions than we are at starting them. And my view was that several of the regimes we had amongst the 31 had outlived their usefulness and risked devaluing the currency. Here come sanctions again. It's all you can ever do. It's your only response. You're heaping them on whether they're effective or not. I really wanted to see fewer, leaner sanctions regimes with a focus on those that deliver concrete results, if that's possible, for our common foreign policy priorities. However, by the time I left, we had 35 sanctions regimes. So I failed dismally in my objectives, though I think I can blame world events at least as much as my own poor performance. But it does actually show how fond politicians are of sanctions because of their ability, particularly when smart, to do different things and to demonstrate activity. What we did manage to do during my time was to introduce a smarter sanctions policy to guide our policymakers, from my friends in the geographical divisions who are saying, conflict breaking out in country X, we must do something, let's do sanctions. I would say no, let's have a think about whether that's actually going to be useful. Here are some guidelines, our smarter sanctions policy. It's not that we weren't doing smart sanctions already, I would argue. We just didn't put that label on it necessarily. Smart is not a British English word, but clever sanctions doesn't have quite the ring to it that smart sanctions does. But also because smart sanctions have been an evolution, not a revolution. It's like that thing where you just at some point realize you've moved into smarter sanctions, but you can't quite put your finger on when that happened. But certainly the clumsy, catch-all, sectoral sanctions, which were essentially punitive in nature, like those we heard about against Iraq, have given way over time, definitely, to more complex, targeted measures aimed at cutting the funding to terrorism, coercing regimes to change their behavior, constraining the ability of individuals or companies actively to support rogue regimes, and there's a whole list of reasons. Just a word on how the UK and EU does sanctions. It may surprise you to know the UK doesn't have any sanctions at all, no bilateral sanctions at all. All 35 sanctions regimes that I was dealing with were through the EU or through the UN via EU legislation. There's a number of reasons that the UK and EU are committed to applying sanctions collectively. One, quite obviously, the collective weight. 28 countries, it's 28 now, George, not 26, it changes all the time. 28 countries applying sanctions measures together has much more of an effect. The more multilateral the sanctions, the greater the effect you can expect to have. Two is the complementarity with a growing EU foreign policy. So the European EU Foreign Affairs Council sits and makes policy pronouncements in region A or country X, and sanctions are used as a European tool as a part of the response to those situations. And three, we don't always say it openly, but competitive advantage. If the UK is imposing sanctions on country X and Germany and France didn't, for example, there wouldn't be A, the collective weight, or B, a fair playing field in the effects of those sanctions. But I will admit that with 28 countries around that table, it can be a slightly cumbersome process. One member state dissenting would mean that the whole of the EU was unable to proceed, but the way that common foreign and security policy works in the EU these days, that is a big ticket to play. To say that you, as one member state, will stick out against a common foreign policy imperative. So you have seen the EU able to move more quickly since the Lisbon Treaty came into effect and respond quite timely, in a timely way to evolving foreign policy situations. Okay, so what are the characteristics of smart sanctions as UK and EU sees them? Well, in a nutshell, obviously, smarter sanctions are aimed at coercing certain behavior going forward rather than punishing behavior looking back. That is the big difference between smarter sanctions and the old type of sanctions that we used to do. Much more complex than that. It's worth taking a look at the different types of measures we now have in the toolbox. And there's a real myriad of them, which is part of the way that sanctions have evolved, and partly our policymakers catching up with the possibilities that sanctions give us to do different things. So we have introduced sanctions in cases of military coup, military incursion, rebel activity, threatening democratic change, nuclear proliferation, chemical weapons, human rights violations, non-implementation of Security Council resolutions. The list actually goes on and on. And so does the number of sanctions tools that we have available, the targets of sanctions. So we have arms embargoes, travel bans, asset freezes, bans on luxury goods, export of oil, bans on charcoal, believe it or not. We have import of nuclear goods and technology, flight bans, sectoral bans. The number of ways in which we can target those sanctions has grown with the evolution of the policy. It's an equally long list, and I won't go through it, of the types of people and entities that we also target. So we've come an awfully long way, I would argue, from blanket sanctions, trade embargoes, and similar pretty blunt tools against countries we don't like for purposes of retribution. I mean, that's just not the market we're in anymore. And it was certainly the sanctions in Iraq that gave the sanctions a bad name. And I still get that quite a lot. Sanctions don't work, they're useless, they just affect regular people. I think there's a bit of a PR job to do around why we're in fact using sanctions. If you're looking at the effectiveness of sanctions, it just depends on why you impose them in the first place. I used to get an argument that the UN sanctions on North Korea were totally ineffective. I mean, what hope did you have of bringing down North Korean economy? Well, that wasn't actually the intention. The intention was a political signaling intention that all members of the Security Council, including China, were unified on that issue of proliferation to North Korea and were prepared to take action together. That sent a much sharper signal to the regime in North Korea than constraining trade with North Korea ever could have. So it's really important to look at the reason that you were imposing the sanctions in the first place before you can assess whether they've actually done any good. And the final thing I would mention is actually knowing when to lift sanctions. Using the promise of sanctions can be as effective as threatening to impose them. Using the promise to lift sanctions can be as effective as threatening to impose them in the first place. We always tell our policymakers in London the two times that the sanctions are most effective are immediately before they're imposed and immediately before they're lifted. Those are the times that give you greater leverage. Once you go over the hump of imposing them, you get that kind of snapback, the rally round the flag effect, and you then have to wait for the possibility of using leverage to lift sanctions. So definitely that is something that we always try and bear in mind. One of our five, as I used to call it, 5 golden truisms of sanctions, with capital letters to make it a thing, to get our policymakers in geographical areas interested in this stuff. And that was one of our 5 golden truisms. Another one was that sanctions do not work on their own. They will never work on their own. They are one of a set of tools that can be used together. And anyone saying these sanctions did not work to achieve a certain purpose, well, no, we knew that when we imposed them. They were intended to work with diplomacy, with other policy tools, as a strategic approach, just one of a variety of tools. They also don't work overnight. We also know that. Iran has taken it's taken us, 10 years or more to get to this stage where we're at now with Iran, to get them to the table with the most complex sanctions regime we've ever had. So another golden truism. I won't spend my time telling very eminent people truisms. But I think that arguably the Iran sanctions building up layer over layer, as you heard, and really becoming almost blanket effects in some sectors. They've come closest of any set of sanctions to the old approach of almost going over the hump of smart sanctions back to the blunt tool approach. They're now so comprehensive in some areas that they are fairly indistinguishable from sectoral bans, some people argue. I mean, I think that actually you can still characterize them as very smart sanctions because they are aimed at certain areas. They are aimed at looking at what is the most vulnerable point of the Iranian economy, what is going to hurt the most. We know the rally around the flag effect, but what is still going to hurt them to the stage where eventually they will know they have to come to the table, that this is unsustainable. And the Iran sanctions still do, despite being so complex, still do, I would argue, follow that, that approach and follow the 5 truisms. Just quickly on Russia-Ukraine, the EU set out its stall on Russia-Ukraine very early, part of a luck of the calendar effect of EU foreign minister meetings happening to happen the day after the Crimea referendum, but nevertheless, we'll take credit for a super quick reaction. But even so, before the so-called Crimean referendum, the EU had already set out its smart approach to sanctions against Russia in advance. It had signaled what is going to happen to Russia if you continue with this aggression against Ukraine. Whether they believed it or not is another issue, but the EU had set out its stall very early. It said there would be measures to isolate Russia from the international system, for example, cancelling the G8 and having a rival G7 club, a G8-1 club in The Hague. We said there would be sanctions on individuals responsible for actions in Ukraine. And we said that if things carried on, the third stage, the Tier 3, as it came to be known, there would be wide-ranging economic measures against Russia. I think that Putin perhaps didn't believe us at that stage. Why not? Because he knew that, and this is an American phrase I really like, skin in the game. Europe has a lot more skin in the game. The Russian trade with the EU is 10 times Russian trade with the US. Therefore, economic sanctions would seriously affect the EU. We spent years building up economic interdependence with Russia as a way of trying to draw them in. So suddenly we were going to be introducing measures which would look to some like they would harm us as much as they would harm the Russians. And also the Russian economy is just of a vastly different scale than any country we've sanctioned before. I heard a statistic the other day that the Russian economy is more than twice as big as all of the other economies we've sanctioned put together, which gives you an idea of some of the stakes that were involved and perhaps led to the calculation by President Putin that we just wouldn't do it. We were just not quite up to it. And of course, we also had to think very carefully of unintended consequences given that scale of economic interdependence. We know there is always over-compliance, that banks say, we'd rather not get involved even in legitimate business because it's to do with Russia, and nasty OFAC will give us trillion-dollar fines. So we know about over-compliance. We tried to build that in. We know about other unintended consequences, humanitarian effects. We tried to ensure that that was not going to be the case, that we weren't targeting the Russian people, we were targeting one set of opinion formers and policymakers. And I think we also tried to ensure that we had a menu of future options lined up ready for further provocation. It's quite important that in the mind games that go on, that we were giving a clear view that if Russia tested us further, there would be a further response. The answer to the question, will the EU and US come with more, had to be, well, poke us and see. And if it's poke us and see, there had to be something there to show once they did the poking. And I think that we just about, because there were a series of provocations, a series of incidents which tested our ability to keep finding more measures which complied with the approach we'd taken, and I think we just about had enough in the cupboard, as Dan Fried says, to always come with more. Now, I've seen quite a lot of criticism of the EU's role in sanctions, particularly Russia sanctions, that the EU was slow to respond, that it had modest ambition, that it was holding back strong US attempts to get Russia to pull back. I think much of this is unfair. The EU has in fact taken some sanctions measures that the US hasn't taken. It has sanctioned many more people in the military. It has a really impressive, comprehensive Crimea sanctions package, which it introduced a long way back. Russian retaliation has, of course, hit the EU much harder than any other country that has imposed sanctions, and so tested that resolve around the table of 28 to keep going and to keep demonstrating that resolve. So I think that there are also particular challenges in the European Union on sanctions. It's fair to say there is now a lucrative market in bringing legal cases against the EU for its sanctions listings. We just didn't know when we were in the days after 9/11, where we were putting anybody who'd Googled Al-Qaeda on the list, that this would come back and that the European Court of Justice would require us to demonstrate that due process had been exercised in reaching that decision. We're much clearer now about what standards are required, and I think that with sanctions regimes you see coming out of the EU these days, they are not only targeted and focused and smart, they're also, as far as possible, legal proof. One big obstacle that we have that the US doesn't have is that our statement of reasons for imposing sanctions designations have to be open source, because the European Court of Justice says that you can't rely on intelligence that the defendant can't see if the listing is challenged in court. So we have to do a lot more work in getting open source material to back up some of our sanctions designations. And I think we're getting there. Very quickly, I promise I'm concluding. Using the constrain, coerce, signal test of have sanctions been effective and not the media's test, which is usually has country X's economy been brought to its knees? Well, that was never the intention, so no, the sanctions haven't been effective in doing that. But have we been able to constrain behavior, coerce better behavior, and signal international resolve and intent? I would say on the Iran example, we have certainly constrained the ability of the regime to develop its nuclear capability in breach of Security Council resolutions. We have coerced the regime, however modestly, into returning to the negotiating table, and we have signaled the P5+1 or E3+3, as we call it in Europe, disapproval of internationally condemned behaviors, and so I would say that the Iran sanctions regime could be said to have been successful in many ways. On Russia, time will tell, I think. We're in the early days. My old truism number 5, sanctions don't work overnight. So, I wouldn't expect necessarily Russia to have pulled back from Ukraine already after the imposition of sanctions that we've had. I think certainly it's arguable whether there has been any effect on Russia's long-term ambitions over Russia and some of its over Ukraine and some of its neighbours, but there certainly has been an effect on some of the short-term tactical calculus. I think we would have seen events unfold much faster had it not been for some of the sanctions that we'd had. So I think we all need to reserve judgment on the Russia sanctions package for now. And I'll stop there, Will.
Very good.
Apologies
Thanks.
for going over time.
No problem. Thanks so much, Richard. A few questions before we throw it open to the audience. And for Elizabeth, I was just struck by the fact that Iran was expelled from the SWIFT system, and that has been a big issue for the Russia sanctions, and so far SWIFT has not been on the table for the most part. Is SWIFT still an option for Russia? taking it out of the international messaging financial system? Or is the situation with Russia so different from Iran that it's unlikely that a SWIFT ban would be provoked? And for Randy, just to kind of, you talked about the laws, but if you could talk a little bit more about the law of unintended consequences with these sanctions in terms of how broad they are and how they've kind of dealt with this issue of overcompliance, and how, because they're so broadly worded and so have such great application, that it has resulted in kind of over compliance, when in fact the sanctions were intended to be much more limited in scope. And for Richard, I can't help but ask what's going to happen in June of 2015. We've heard various rumblings in Greece, and obviously we had the visit of the Greek Prime Minister to Moscow last week. But it's more than one country that has voiced its reluctance to continue the sanctions. It's Slovenia, it's Hungary, rumblings in Italy. There's been a growing number. So do we actually face, come June, a pivotal time when this unanimity that has so far been displayed for sanctions is somehow lost, and therefore the EU has to change its policy on sanctions? Is that unlikely, likely? Where do you think that stands? So Elizabeth, you could.
Okay, I'll start. So how is SWIFT sanctions for Iran different than SWIFT sanctions for Russia? There's a huge ocean of difference between them. Recall that in the case of Iran, when the EU imposed SWIFT sanctions on Iran, specifically when it threw out those designated Iranian banks from the SWIFT system, which is not the same thing as saying all of Iran. So it's about 24 banks, including their central bank. But that happened at the end of a very long buildup. I hoped in my long description of this layering on of these sanctions, I could help to sketch the picture that by the time 2012 happened, Iran was significantly isolated in the financial system, and throwing it out of the SWIFT system was significant for Iran, but at the end of a long process of diplomatic and financial isolation. Russia it's a different economy. It's much larger. It's much more connected to the to the EU, to the United States, to the international financial system, and throwing Russia out, let me just leave it at that for one moment, from the SWIFT system right now would be catastrophic for Russia, for all of us, perhaps for our pension plans, for our children's savings accounts, and more specifically for France, which happens to be extremely exposed within the EU to Russia. What would it mean to throw out Russia? Presumably, you could think of that as the specific banks, the BIC codes for the specific banks that have been designated within Russia, or on which certain sanctions have been imposed, or you could think more broadly. In any case, it would be very significant economically. And furthermore, signaling from Russia has been that doing so would be tantamount to economic warfare. And this is, I have heard it described by some folks heavily exposed in the private sector, that this could look like Armageddon to Russia, which would prompt them to think seriously about not repaying foreign debt obligations, i.e. defaulting, as an act of retaliation. So let me be very clear that, in fact, I think that would be an incredibly aggressive move, and we're just not there yet politically.
Randy?
First, I agree with that with your answer. On overcompliance and unintended consequences, I'm not sure that the consequences were unintended. I think the executive orders were issued with rather explicit commentary that they were meant to be narrow, that they were meant to be focused, that if, from the point of view of the U.S. government, Russian aggression continued, they would be increased. As I mentioned, each one sort of hinted at the next, foreshadowed the next level of increase. But it was always explained that these were narrow and focused. But I think the policymakers understood, or should have understood, that they weren't that. That if you put sanctions on all the major Russian state-owned banks, which is a major part of the Russian banking system, and remember, Russia still is a largely state-influenced economy, that was going to have impact on deals well beyond just those that are providing debt to 5 specific banks. That many of the commercial banks have connections, even ownership connections to the state banks. And the way OFAC does this is that it's aggregated interest. If you are owned 20% by Vnestorg Bank and 31% by Vnesheconom Bank, that makes you 51%, and that makes you subject to the sanctions. So I think OFAC has been taking a broader view of involvement. And I think also there's a bit of a context that even before the Ukraine situation, that there was anybody doing deals in Russia was very conscious of the bribery issue, and there was already over-compliance and extensive due diligence with regard to who owned what and who was involved in what, that had to do with fears of not just OFAC fining you trillions, but Department of Justice and SEC fining you trillions. And it's been a nice thing for lawyers because people want to do much more due diligence than they used to do. But some of it, I have to say, but some of it is almost silly to the extent that they do it. But it indicates a reluctance to invest in Russia. And we have clients that won't even start the due diligence. They'll say, we just won't deal with Russia. Our board won't let us deal with Russia because it will take us forever with investigators and lawyers to figure out if we violate the sanctions. And I don't think that was unintended.
Mm-hmm. Richard.
Will the EU roll over its economic sanctions package before the 1st of July? I could fall back on the I'm not allowed to say anything controversial line. What I will say is that actually the EU has been very clear all along of exactly what it's intended to do. It has followed through, and although there have been individual member states who have been less comfortable with some of the approaches, and I think that that's absolutely natural. All 28 member states have different relationships, have different exposure in different sectors. We could have drawn a breath over some of the financial sanctions given the position of the City of London. We didn't. We thought that was something that was inevitable and the right thing to do. But it's inevitable there'll be a debate about what we do at the 1-year re-evaluation stage and how we take that forward. What we have said in the last European Council meeting was that we want to tie sanctions to the Minsk agreement and Russia's compliance with the provisions of the Minsk agreement. So that is a firm position that we have, which will actually take us beyond July. This actually goes to the point of what are we actually trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve is some kind of way of drawing Russia into dialogue over Ukraine and working out a sensible way forward. We're also linking it to withdrawal of Russian forces or Russian backed forces from eastern Ukraine. And we need to achieve all of that through dialogue. So the Minsk agreement is, I think, the only diplomatic game in town at the moment on Russia-Ukraine, and we are throwing our weight behind, and the sanctions need to be a tool of achieving political agreement rather than have a life of their own. So that's the approach that we're going to take.
Okay, very good. Open the floor for questions. Ed. We'll get a microphone to you. Right up front here.
Ed Verona, McClarty Associates. Richard, I wonder if you could just go one step further. The Minsk agreements include a reversal of Russia's annexation of Crimea. Is that what European Council President Tusk meant when he said full compliance with the Minsk agreements as a condition for lifting the sanctions?
I think the EU has been really very clear all along on Crimea, which said that it was what happened there was not legal. We don't accept it. We will never recognize Crimea as a part of Russia. So I think that is a pretty plain statement of the position. There is a sanctions package linked specifically to Crimea, and Crimea was one of the original reasons why the sanctions package was imposed. So I think that we will have to take a view on how the Minsk agreement proceeds and what compliance looks like on both sides before we can take a view on what any of those, the future of any of those parts of the sanctions package.
Right in the front here.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. I'd like to go back a little bit to this blowback idea of the negative consequences of some of these sanctions. We all know that even when Europe and the United States agree, there's a lot of other characters that are willing to step in to take advantage of the business opportunities that exist. The smugglers, organized crime, and some legitimate businesses as well from other countries. Is there any effort made to try to ascertain what that economic damage is? You know, when we promulgate a regulation from the EPA or anyone else here, we try to get an estimate of what the overall economic damage could be from it. Is the same being done for sanctions in any quarter?
Can I do this? Yeah. Something I think is really interesting about the sanctions, think of the ones that Congress has imposed. Though there have been lots of sanctions authorities, new ones, even in the last several months, right, since December, Russia, Venezuela, cyber, et cetera. Has there ever been a request by Congress to study the economic effects? That happens all the time in other pieces of legislation. It happens when the military contemplates drone strikes. It happens in all kinds of acts of foreign policy. And it hasn't happened for this. I think it would be a good idea. It would help us, it would help policymakers in the United States think carefully about weighing the costs of taking some of these actions and how best to potentially to consider a holistic approach towards a particular foreign policy problem or objective.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very important question for Russia too, because of all that we keep saying about Russia being such a large economy and so interconnected with Europe and the economic consequences, with both in connection with the European countries, but also for the effect on the Russian economy and the future direction of Russia. I think that my sense is that the U.S. government hasn't looked into it so much yet because they think of these as short-term sanctions. So short-term effects aren't serious economic issues. But I think it does go against our efforts to integrate them into the world economy, which means setting up banks that aren't corrupt.
Does the EU have a
well, I think
ability to do this?
What we certainly do is when we impose sanctions, to look at how they are being evaded and to try and close loopholes. What we don't do, which the US does, is have extraterritorial effect of our sanctions, or at least not in quite the same way, and sometimes in effect rather than in law. So the avenues may not always be available to prevent that, but we do take a very close look at how sanctions are being gotten around, some of the effects of the sanctions, and to try to tailor the effect to make sure they have no more or no less of an effect than we intended in the first place, and some of the unintended consequences are addressed and dealt with.
We'll take some questions together here. So here and then here. So right here. 2 questions.
I'd like to ask Mr. Wood, Beth Pond, a journalist and author in Berlin. I'm rather fuzzy on where the line is in these sanctions, where you have to have unanimity and where you can make changes, shifts without. It seems to be flexible, but I don't understand where the line is. And related to that, I asked a question not about June, but about December. And am I correct in thinking that there's basically a political consensus in the EU that the present sanctions will go through, if not an actual European Council decision, will go through December. And then what?
I'll take this question right here.
Roman Mamonov, Independent Russian Channel. Don't you think that we overrated actually sanctions effect? Because look, the Russian central bank forced the Visa and the MasterCard to transfer all operations to Russia, so that will just, there's no effect for Russian banks actually now. Second thing, that even the American Treasury Department said that American drills company can actually offer services to Russian companies, but through affiliated company in Europe. And we see that now that Schlumberger buying the Russian company, biggest drilling company. So it seems like there are a lot of loopholes in all this sanction regime. And by the way, about the personal sanctions against Russian tycoons, they just transferred all the assets to kids, wives, other relatives. So there is no real effect, it seems so. No?
So Richard will have the first one. Richard will have.
Yes, on Minsk. Yes, the decision was that we would tie any decision on sanctions to Minsk rather than to an arbitrary deadline in July. However, all sanctions expire in the EU after 1 year, so they do need to be renewed in order to go through to December. And all decisions on sanctions, because it's a common foreign and security policy, are done by unanimity. So all member states have to agree on any amendment or lift or rollover of a sanctions regime. So it's always done by unanimity.
Overrated sanctions and the ability of Russians to get around them. Anyone want to? You or go ahead.
This is sort of a different category of unintended consequences, in that people adjust to sanctions, as was mentioned earlier, and people find ways, some legal, some illegal, ways to adjust to the sanctions. And I think that's not, on the whole, healthy for the future of the Russian economy or for our view of the Russian economy. But I still think that even with this adjustment, that the sanctions are having a very important effect on perception for foreign investors coming in to Russia to do big projects. So there's much more hesitation, and it doesn't matter, as we've said before, it doesn't matter even what the specifics of the sanctions are. They've created a perception which in the business world matters.
Okay. We're going to go here. We'll take these three, here, here, and here. So very short questions.
Sam Cutler, Ferrari and Associates. Are our smart sanctions smart enough? The smart sanctions are by definition supposed to be a two-faced coin, that certain types of transactions are supposed to be prohibited and other types are supposed to be allowed. But in practice, we've noted here the overcompliance issue, and Mr. Wood noticed the humanitarian impacts on Iran. Do we do a good enough job of promoting the types of transactions that we say are in the foreign policy interests of the United States, but in practice there's a great deal of confusion about what is allowed or...
Okay, very good. And we're going to go in the back here. Mm-hmm. Saw a third hand.
Hi, Tom O'Donnell. I do Energy and International Affairs. Actually, I'm here from Berlin as with the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies to study these issues, especially for the English gentleman. My question is, for the European Union, how much, I understand the effectiveness of the sanctions and non-effectiveness, but say Mr. Putin decides to about double the territory he controls, or his friends control in Ukraine, which is quite possible, to make a land bridge to Crimea and so forth. The first thing Mr. Steinmeier always says is, anything but a political solution is unthinkable. He starts everything with that. Will the European Union double the sanctions, or will the European Union, can you see a possibility where they might actually help the Ukrainians defend their territory? How much really, you get a feeling in Berlin after a while that it's an excuse for not doing other things, perhaps.
Okay. We'll go with those two last questions. Okay, so.
Shall I start on the?
Yes, smarter.
So I'm going to answer your question by taking it in this direction, which is how do we promote the transactions, the legal trade, and humanitarian and permitted humanitarian trade, where take for Iran, there's other cases too. I think it's important to think here about, so we should contemplate here the compliance environment and a concern about compliance, also the risk factors that banks take into, international banks in particular, take into account when they're thinking about which deals to finance, what trades, where they want to provide underwriting services, that sort of thing. And then also, which is quite severe, and certainly it's these financial institutions don't have the kind of comfort that they would need from financial regulators in the United States and elsewhere, that they can move into permitted trade on paper and not get up close, but see themselves as staying away from violating these sanctions. The financial regulators, the policymakers that we have in the United States that create these policy sanctions, it's a few hundred people at absolute most in the greatest accounting of it, who are all schooled in how to create and impose sanctions. They're not so much schooled in how to take these away and how to create opportunities or promote these opportunities for legitimate trade to occur. They don't like white lists. They don't like safe harbors as strategies to create the confidence for private sector actors and those evaluating risk in foreign financial institutions to go ahead and do permitted humanitarian trade. And to the point that was made on the earlier panel, perhaps we should have an approach, a post-war approach to economic building, creating a rules-based economic system, international rules-based economic system, and growth and prosperity, creating incentives for enhanced trade, and being a responsible actor in the financial system. Certainly we'd need that in any case where sanctions are lifted. We also need that in cases where there's permitted humanitarian trade and it's suffering. It's not occurring because of this overwhelming reluctance on the part of financial institutions to get involved in this trade. The couple hundred people we have in the United States who are in charge of sanctions are not enough. That is not enough people. These aren't the right mechanisms. The institutionalization of discussion with the private sector to get feedback on what can happen, that is not the structure that can facilitate the kind of humanitarian trade that is permitted now and that would be permitted under a major sanctions lifting scenario like the case of Iran. For example, right? Yeah.
Richard.
No.
What would the EU do if there's further provocation? I'm going to say the EU would have to sit down and discuss it around the table, and I'm not saying that to be evasive. I'm saying that because there are likely to be different views, and it depends on the exact circumstances. And I think it's, as I said before, it's not unreasonable to expect there to be a range of views in the room in the European Union. Germany and France are heavily invested in the Minsk process, or the process that led to the Minsk agreement. There are some that have traditional ties with Russia. There are some that are developing ties with Russia. There are some who have other types of relationships. So you're not going to have an immediately or a foreseeably uniform view on any set of circumstances. However, the principle of it, you said that Herr Steinmeier regularly says that anything but a diplomatic solution is unthinkable. Of course, the diplomatic solution has to be the basis of a sensible outcome between Russia and Ukraine. I absolutely agree with that. And it's about using all of the foreign policy tools that you have, the diplomatic process, the Minsk, multilateral fora, sanctions as one of the tools in the toolbox, as a comprehensive approach to try and deliver that. So it's quite a complicated set of slide rules involved, and I think that we would have to see how further sanctions might play a helpful role, and depending on the exact actions. So I'm sorry, it wasn't meant to be evasive, but it is it's a naturally difficult thing to predict. Oh, don't try and tempt me down that route.
Exactly. Randy, one final word here.
Actually, want to end with a question, which is what I kind of thought you were leading to. What if the question for people here in the U.S. is what will the U.S. Government do if the EU pulls back from the sanctions? let's assume things stay the same in Ukraine, which some could say the Minsk process is working, some could say it's not working, and that could divide the EU enough that it decides to cut back. Do we cut back? Unanswered question. I'm not running for office.
It's never good to end a panel with such a profound question. And I'm sure that maybe the ambassador will be able to give us some advice on that over lunchtime as to where the U.S. sanctions are going forward.
It was a segue question.
Very good, and I appreciate that, Randy. So if we could just start moving across the hallway, we'll have lunch. And thank our panelists again for really very informative and interesting panel. Very good, great.
It's different from the other.